For most people, interest rates feel like something that happens to them. Your mortgage payment goes up, your credit card suddenly hurts more. Your savings account finally starts paying something, and then stops. And the explanation is always the same: inflation. The Federal Reserve. Central banks doing their job. But what if the real reason interest rates could rise again in 2026 has very little to do with inflation headlines, and much more to do with something deeper, quieter, and far more structural? To understand what's coming, we need to rewind, not years, but decades. For nearly 40 years, the global economy lived in a world where interest rates kept falling. Every crisis pushed them lower. Every slowdown was met with cheaper money. And every time people said, "This has to be the bottom," rates somehow found a way to go lower. That long decline shaped everything: house prices, stock markets, tech booms, government debt, even how comfortable we became borrowing from the future. But that era quietly ended, not with a crash, not with a single announcement, but with a realization that the old playbook no longer works the way it used to. When inflation surged in the early 2000s, central banks reacted aggressively. Rates jumped at the fastest pace in modern history. And by 2024 and 2025, markets began breathing again. Inflation cooled, growth slowed, and everyone started asking the same question: when do rates come back down? But that assumption may be wrong. Because inflation wasn't the disease, it was the symptom. The real issue is that the world is becoming more expensive by design. Start with labor. For decades, the global economy relied on cheap labor from abroad. Manufacturing moved where wages were lowest. Services followed. Prices stayed down, not because companies were generous, but because supply chains were ruthlessly efficient. Populations in the US, the UK, and Australia are aging. Fewer workers are entering the labor force. Immigration is politically constrained, and workers who remain have more leverage than they've had in generations. Higher wages aren't a spike, they're a shift. And higher wages don't disappear when inflation slows. Then there's geopolitics. The world used to prioritize efficiency. Now it prioritizes resilience. Supply chains are being rebuilt closer to home. Redundancy is replacing optimization. Security is replacing speed. That sounds sensible, and it is. But it comes at a cost. Everything becomes slightly more expensive. Energy, manufacturing, defense, technology, and governments are willing to pay that cost. Which brings us to the part almost no one likes to talk about: government debt. The US, the UK, and Australia all carry debt loads that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. For years, low interest rates made this manageable. Suddenly, interest payments compete with healthcare, with pensions, with defense budgets. And governments face a choice: cut spending, raise taxes, or borrow even more. Historically, they choose to borrow. That competition pushes yields higher, and central banks, despite their independence, can't ignore a bond market under pressure. This is where the story turns. Central banks don't set rates in a vacuum. They respond to inflation, yes, but also to financial stability, government financing, and global capital flows. As populations age, savings patterns change. Retirees draw down assets instead of accumulating them. That prices interest rates. This is why 2026 matters. Not because inflation will suddenly explode again, but because the forces pushing rates down are weaker, while the forces pushing them up are persistent. Markets may expect cuts, politicians may hope for relief, but the economic foundation has shifted, and the uncomfortable possibility is this: it's that people aren't prepared for a world where they don't fall the way they used to. If interest rates stay higher, or rise again, the effects won't show up all at once. They'll arrive quietly, unevenly, and by the time most people notice, the adjustment will already be underway. Start with households. For years, homeowners in the US, the UK, and Australia were trained to think the same way: just wait. Rates will come back down. Refinance later. That logic worked when interest rates moved in long cycles downward. But in a world where rates are structurally higher, waiting becomes a risk. Mortgage resets start to bite. Fixed rate terms expire. Monthly payments stay elevated longer than expected. And the real pressure doesn't come from new buyers. Housing markets don't collapse in this scenario. They stagnate. Prices stop rising the way people expect. Transactions slow. Sellers hesitate. Buyers wait. And over time, housing quietly shifts from a wealth engine into something closer to a utility. A place to live, not a guaranteed investment. That change alone has massive ripple effects. Because when housing stops doing the heavy lifting, everything else feels tighter. Now look at businesses. Higher interest rates don't just make borrowing more expensive, they change behavior. Companies become selective. Expansion slows, risk appetite shrinks. Profitability could wait. Growth was rewarded more than discipline. That era is fading. In a higher rate world, cash flow matters again. Balance sheets matter again. And companies that relied on easy refinancing find themselves exposed. Investors often assume rate cuts are bullish and rate hikes are bearish. Reality is more nuanced. If rates rise again in 2026 because inflation returns, that's bad news. Then valuations simply have to adjust, not crash. Adjust. Returns become slower, less explosive, more uneven. Some sectors benefit: energy, defense, infrastructure. The market doesn't reward stories anymore. It rewards durability. And this brings us back to central banks. But control has limits. Central banks can influence short-term rates. They can guide expectations. They can provide liquidity in crises. What they can't easily do is fight structural forces without consequences. Cut rates too aggressively and inflation resurfaces. Suppress yields and currency weakness follows. Support governments too openly and credibility erodes. So instead of dramatic moves, policy becomes cautious, reactive, incremental. And that's why 2026 could surprise people, not with a shock, but with persistence. Rates don't fall as fast as hoped. Economic growth doesn't rebound the way forecasts predict, and the temporary period starts feeling permanent. For individuals, this demands a mindset shift. Debt isn't neutral anymore. Leverage isn't automatically rewarded. And financial plans built on falling rates need revisiting. And the temptation to quietly inflate away debt never fully disappears. Which is why inflation risks don't vanish. They linger. Not in dramatic spikes, but in steady pressure. This is the real reason interest rates could rise again in 2026. Not because central banks want them to. Not because inflation headlines demand it. But because the world has changed in ways that don't easily reverse. The age of endlessly cheap money required very specific conditions. Young populations. Global cooperation. What replaces them is a world that's more fragmented, more expensive, and more cautious. And in that world, interest rates don't fall freely. And that's the uncomfortable truth markets are still coming to terms with. If you found this breakdown useful, take a moment to like the video. It helps more than you think. Subscribe if you want calm, clear explanations of the forces shaping money, markets, and the future. And let me know in the comments what you think. Do you believe higher rates are temporary? Or are we already living in the new normal? Because the next few years will quietly answer that question for all of us.